Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Daf Yomi Shabbat, 1 week at a time. This is our 13th lesson, and today we're going to do Dafim Yud Tet 19 till Kaf Hey 25. We're going to review some of the key topics that we've been discussing in these Dafim, and then we're going to learn about Chanukah together, even though of course, it is almost Pesach, but what better time to learn about Hanukkah? So we're going to start with Daf Yutet. We're going to do a review. On Daf Yutet, we were talking about what we should be concerned about for us about non-Jews and before entering Shabbat. So it talks about renting vessels to non-Jews before Shabbat, also sending letters. It talks about things that are forbidden to do close to Shabbat as it's getting later in the day. It talks about also not necessarily later in the day, but later in the week. So if you were to embark on a journey on a boat, you should not set sail within 3 days of Shabbat. The Mefarshim explain why this is a problem. One says that, Tosfot says it's actually a problem of swimming, right? We're nervous that if you're on a boat and it gets to Shabbat, we're nervous that you're going to have to maybe jump off of the boat and you're going to have to swim. Other Mefarshim talk about you getting seasick on Shabbat, and that's why it's a problem to be on a boat on Shabbat, and it's not oneg Shabbat, you're not enjoying the Shabbat. Another says you might have to actually work, right? Do melacha. You have to work on Shabbat in order to sail wherever you need to go. The Gemara continues and talks about laying siege to a city. You shouldn't do that within 3 days of Shabbat. Also laundering clothing or giving it to the launderer. There's a difference between white clothes and colored clothing. And then the Gemara starts talking about juices that flow out of either grapes or olives on Shabbat. And because that's what the daf was talking about, I actually brought you some pictures here. For those of you who are not familiar on how you make olives, this is actually an ancient olive press. This is a picture of Katzrin, which was a Talmudic village. And you can see here, actually olives were put in this circular crevice here on this stone. This pole was generally pushed around by an animal, and the large stone would crush the olives. After the olives were crushed, everything that was here, down here under this grindstone, was put into a basket and brought to this. This is called, in Hebrew, it's called a Beit Habad, and it is an olive press. And what they would do is, where you see my arrow, they would actually put the baskets of olives here underneath this, I guess on top of this stone and underneath this large log. And then they would weigh down this log with these large stones over here, and that would create oil. The oil would drip right here into the hole. So our Gemara actually talks about, can we place those baskets of olives here and just let, again, if you look here, if I'm just hanging a stone from this log, nothing is really working very difficult, right? It's not working very hard. It's actually just stagnant, but the weight is going to help release the oil. So that's an olive press. So too with grapes, meaning grapes were actually put on a stone surface and were generally stepped on in order to release the grape juice. So the Gemara discusses, if the juice is going to flow by itself without anybody having to do anything, then that would perhaps be okay to set this process in motion before Shabbat. So especially if there was no action needed. And then the question is, can this be done or not? The Mishnah on Daf Yud Tet starts to talk about different processes that can be started before Shabbat, even though they will go into Shabbat. So the Gemara, the Mishnah and the Gemara discuss food that can be put on a fire before Shabbat. The question is, what type of food can be put on the fire before Shabbat? And the Gemara talks about how much it needs to be cooked. We're going to get there in a second on the next daf. The Mishnah also talks about bread being baked before Shabbat. Just so you should know, in terms of baking bread on in the olden days, they would have an oven. I mean, these days also, but I guess it depends what kind of bread you're making. They would take the dough and stick it up on the surface, I would say the roof of the oven, and that's how they would bake their bread, almost like a pita. So it discusses if you can do that before Shabbat. And another concept that was brought up in this Mishnah is the Beit HaMoked, which was a chamber in the temple, on the Temple Mount, where there would be a large fire for all the priests, for all the Kohanim to warm themselves during their service or in between. So the Gemara discusses if that fire can be lit before Shabbat or may be lit on Shabbat. The Gemara continues on Daf Chaf on 20. As I mentioned before, we talked about putting food onto the stove before Shabbat, and there's a concept called Ma'achal Ben Drusai. And the Gemara explains that basically there was a thief whose name was Ben Drusai, and he actually liked, I don't know if he liked, but he ate his food pretty raw, I guess because he was running around a lot. And there's a machloket if it's half cooked or a third cooked. I actually mentioned this last week in our shir. So here it's mentioned again on Daf Chaf on 20, that if your food is cooked at least half or a third, it may be left on the fire before Shabbat. Another concept on Daf Chaf is the burning of the limbs of the Evarim in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash. So just to understand, the work day in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, started in the morning, even though in Jewish tradition our day starts at night. In the temple, it actually does start in the morning. And all the sacrifices that were brought on that day, that night in the evening, the limbs or the internal organs that needed to be burnt would be put on the fire. So the Gemara discusses that all the sacrifices that were brought on Friday night on Shabbat, you can burn, the Kohanim can burn those internal organs on the altar, on the Mizbeach, on Shabbat. It then continues to talk about different types of fire. And if you light a fire before Shabbat, how much of that fire needs to be lit or burning before Shabbat. The concept of rov, meaning a majority. And of course, the Gemara asks, what does it mean a majority of the fire needs to be burning? Is it a majority of the log? Is it a majority of its circumference? Is it a majority of its thickness? So that is a conversation in the Gemara. And it's the parak, actually, the chapter finishes with a discussion between wood burning and reeds that burn very quickly, and therefore they do not have to be mostly burnt before Shabbat because they are going to burn so quickly. And with that, we finish our first chapter of Masechet Shabbat. We are now starting our second chapter on Daf Chaf on 20 with a very famous Mishnah that starts with Bameh Madlikin. This is famous because we actually say it, at least Ashkenazim say it on Friday night in the Friday night prayer. This Mishnah is recited, and the discussion is what types of wicks and oils are you allowed to use to light the Shabbat candles. And it starts with the forbidden wicks. What are you forbidden to to light with. These are generally either things or fabrics that will, or substances that don't really draw up the oil, or they burn very quickly and therefore they're not meant as good wicks. Daf Kaf Aleph 21 talks about forbidden oils and goes through different types of oil. The question is, why are they forbidden? Either because they have a bad smell or because they don't burn very well. The Gemara continues and talks about if the oil and wicks are not allowed to be used on Shabbat, what about using them for Chanukah? So I'm going to skip all of this actually of 21 because I would like to learn that together with you. I'm going to continue down to Daf Kaf Bet, the next page, 22, where we have the top of Daf Kaf Bet talks about a famous story of Joseph, who was put in the pit by his brothers. The Torah says that the pit was empty, and our Gemara says it was empty of water, but it was actually filled with scorpions. The Gemara is going to continue for a few more pages on the topic of Chanukah, and it talks about where we actually place our Chanukiah, and it says that we put it on the left side of our door because the right side has the mezuzah, and therefore the left side would have the Chanukiah, and therefore we are surrounded by mitzvot. The Gemara continues and talks about what we can use as, what we can do with the light of the Hanukkah candles, right? Are we allowed to use that light or not? And the Gemara talks about a concept called bizayon. Right? Bizayon is basically a disgrace of the mitzvah, meaning if we use it as a common light, then we are disgracing the actual commandment of having something special in our house. The Gemara on Kaf Bet brings up a few other concepts that are tangential. I just want to explain some of them. One being the concept of kisui hadam. Kisui hadam is an action that needs to be done when you are killing a bird, a fowl, for to eat. If we use shechtet, if the blood falls on the ground, it needs to be covered. This is a special concept, a special mitzvah that is only for fowl and wild animals, but not domesticated animals. Meaning, this does not have to be done if you are shechting a cow, but if it is, or a sheep or a goat, but for chickens you do, and it's called kisui hadam. You have to cover the blood with the dirt that's on the floor. And the question is, how do you do that? And the Gemara says you don't kick the dirt over the blood because that is, again, a bizayon, a disgrace. So that's why it's brought up here in our Gemara. What about the Gemara moves on to talk about the schach in Sukkot, right? In Sukkot, we build these huts outside, and the top of the hut, oh, it's funny, if you look at the picture here on your screen, that actually looks like schach. The top of the hut generally has what's called schach, some sort of roof that is natural, man-made, but made out of natural things, so usually it's wood or bamboo. But in the days of the Gemara, they would actually hang fruit from the roof. So the Gemara asks, are you allowed to eat from your schach? Meaning, if you're sitting in your sukkah and there's grapes hanging down, can I pull them off and eat them? And the Gemara says that you can't because, again, this concept of bizayon, we are disgracing the mitzvah that is the sukkah. The Gemara also talks about, what if I have a Chanukiah, I have my lamp for Chanukah, can I light from one candle to another? The assumption at first is I'm lighting directly from one to another. The other option is that maybe I'm lighting with a match from one to the other. And the Gemara says that If you do this, there are two issues. Either, again, as I mentioned, bizayon, this disgracing the mitzvah, or makhish mitzvah, meaning that we are weakening the mitzvah. And that is the question. If we're using a match, that would be more disgraceful because I'm now taking something that has sanctity of a mitzvah and now putting a match to it, as opposed to just going from candle to candle, meaning without an intermediary. The Gemara continues and talks about the menorah, the candelabrum that was in the temple, and because, the candelabrum is the reason that we light our Chanukah on Chanukah, and talks about why we actually needed the light from the candelabrum in the temple at all, right? Does God need light in the mikdash, right? God doesn't need our light. And the Gemara beautifully says that the menorah, the candelabrum, is actually an edut, a testimony that God's presence rests here in the world or in the temple, right? And that he doesn't really need the candle. It's for us to bring that light into the temple. The Gemara talks about the miracle that the candle would actually last, and I'm not talking about the miracle of Chanukah, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but talks about the miracle in the temple daily. There was one candle that would burn much longer than all the other candles. The Gemara continues and asks, what is the actual mitzvah of Chanukah? Is it the lighting of the candles, or is it the placing of the Chanukah, the candelabrum, in our either window or doorway? The Daf Kaf Gimel 23 basically in the end says that the mitzvah is to light the candle, and we know because the actual blessing when we light the candles is Asher Kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, right? God commanded us to Lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, to light the candles, and therefore the Gemara says that the mitzvah is actually done by lighting the candles. The Gemara, of course, asks, how is it possible that we say Asher Kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu? How can I say that God commanded us to light the Chanukah candles? God in the Torah, right? Chanukah happens much later in our history. So how is it possible that God commanded us to light the Chanukah candles? And the Gemara explains that basically God gave the rabbis the ability to create new mitzvot, right? New commandments. This is what we call mitzvot d'Rabbanan, right? The sages were able to create new commandments, so much so that we're allowed to say vitzivanu, that God commanded, because God commanded us to be able to for us to be able to listen, or that we need to listen to the sages and the mitzvot that they command us. The Gemara continues to say that women are obligated to light the Chanukah candles, and very famous line in the Gemara is Af hen hayu be'oto hanes, right? That also women were a part of the miracle. This can be understood in two ways. One is that just like the men were saved, so too the women were saved. This line, Af hen hayu be'oto hanes, is used in multiple places in the Gemara. Here for candle lighting, in Pesach, when we talk about for us now, when we say that women are obligated to, let's say, drink 4 cups of wine, we say, why are they obligated? Because again, af hen hayu be'oto hanes, women were also involved in the miracle. They were also saved. The other place is that Mikra Megillah. On Purim, women are obligated to hear the Megillah because, again, they were also saved. Another way to understand this line or this concept is because women were also an integral part of the miracle, meaning that's very easy for Purim. We have Esther. For Pesach, they say that the women, the righteous women, were one of the reasons that we were redeemed from Egypt. For Chanukah, there's the story of Yehudit. She actually killed one of the Greek generals and therefore assisted in the salvation of the Jewish people. So again, afhein, that women were also a part of the miracle, either because they were saved or because they were an integral part, they did the saving. The Gemara continues and talks about olive oil. Again, for those of you who joined late, we're looking here at a picture of an oil press. This is how oil was made in the time of the Gemara and the Mishnah. So the Gemara says that basically olive oil is the best for Chanukah candles. It's also the best for Shabbat. It is also, the Gemara continues and talks about the mitzvah of pe'ah. Pe'ah was one of the mitzvot that the farmer needed to do in order to give gifts to the poor. The farmer needed to leave the corners of his field untouched, basically unharvested, and the poor people would come at the end of the harvest and they would be able to take from those corners. It was basically a way to give charity, but it's a mitzvah, meaning the farmer needed to leave those corners. The Gemara talks about concern for arousing suspicion. And the Gemara says that basically when they left pe'ah, they needed to make sure that it was done, everybody did it at the same time. Therefore, you couldn't walk down the street and say, oh, look at that farmer, he doesn't leave pe'ah, or he left it yesterday. So the Gemara continues and talks about what takes precedence. Let's say you only have a certain amount of money. What do I go and buy? Do I buy candles for Shabbat? Do I buy candles for Chanukah? Do I buy wine for Kiddush? So the Gemara on Daf Kaf Gimel discusses the priorities and which one is more important. Another concept that comes up on Daf Kaf Gimel is the concept of Shalom Bayit, and we're going to see that in a few dapim. But this idea that we light the Shabbat candles because we want Shalom Bayit. Shalom Bayit actually means peace in the home, and the Gemara says that it's really important to have light in our homes, and that leads to a peaceful environment. Whether that means you're not tripping on things, or it means that you're sitting at the table and you're able to see what you're eating. But this idea that it's important to create that atmosphere is an integral part of Shabbat and the Shabbos candles. Another concept that came up on Kaf Gimel on 23 is the concept of tadir, which I think we've mentioned before. Tadir, the she'eno tadir, tadir kodem. The Gemara says it's about frequency. The thing that is most frequent is something that is done first or gets priority, as opposed to something that is less frequent. So again, Kiddush and Shabbat candles are more frequent than Chanukah candles. Daf Kaf Dalet 24 talks about mentioning Chanukah in our prayers. So in our Shmona Esrei, in the silent Amidah, we mention Chanukah in a special prayer called Al Hanisim. In Al Hanisim, we basically thank God for all the miracles that occurred on this day, meaning either we say it on Chanukah or we say it on Purim. And the Gemara asks, what about Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals? Do we mention the holiday as well? And the answer is yes. We do say Al Hanisim in Birkat HaMazon as well. Excuse me. The Gemara continues and talks about mentioning Chanukah in Musaf, in the additional prayer of the day. And what happens if it's Rosh Chodesh, right, the beginning of the month, or Shabbat, all of which do happen over the 8-day period of Chanukah? Do we mention Chanukah in the Musaf prayer? Now, what's interesting is the Gemara says the Musaf prayer is only said because it's Shabbat or because it's Rosh Chodesh, because it's the beginning of the month. It is not said in general on Chanukah. So do we mention Chanukah in a prayer that is coming for a different reason, right? Because a different day, because of Shabbat or Rosh Chodesh, or do we say no? We actually, meaning yes, we do mention Chanukah, even though we're not saying this prayer because of Chanukah, but we are going to mention it because anytime we are going to pray, we're going to mention that it is Chanukah, and that is actually what we do. Practically. The same question comes up in the blessings after the Haftorah. The Haftorah, of course, is the reading from the prophets after we read from the Torah portion. And there also, do we mention, let's say, Rosh Chodesh in the blessings of the Haftorah? It seems also from this daf of Gemara that there was a custom to read from the prophets, from the Navi, even in Mincha, in the afternoon prayer on Shabbat. This is not done nowadays. Nowadays, we read from the Torah, we read from the Torah portion of the following week, but there is no haftarah, there is no prophet reading, meaning reading from the prophets in Mincha, but it seems that at the time of the Gemara, that is something that was done. The Gemara continues at the bottom of Daf Kaf Dalid to talk about Shemen Sreifa. Shemen Sreifa, the Gemara explains, is oil that is truma. Again, I think we've mentioned this in previous classes, but truma was one of the gifts that was separated from the produce and given to the Kohanim. Now, this truma had going back to last week's class, this truma had a special, I would say, sanctity, and it's called, right, it was kadosh, it has a special sanctity, and you needed to make sure that it didn't become tameh, again, ritually impure. As I mentioned last week, we talked about ritual impurity. If the truma becomes tameh, it means that it needed to be burnt. That's the way that you discarded or got rid of the truma. There's a special dispensation to oil that became tameh, that you were allowed to burn it and get pleasure, hana'ah. You were allowed to get a benefit from the burning of this oil. So the Gemara on Daf Kaf Hey on 25 says, in general, you were allowed to burn the Shemen Sreifa, again, the oil that was truma, that became tameh. However, you are not allowed to burn it on Yom Tov. And the Gemara gives three sources of why you can't do that. Another concept that comes up on Daf Kaf Hey is the concept of an aseh doche lo taseh. What does that mean? We have two types of commandments: positive commandments, aseh, and negative commandments, lo taseh. Now, the Gemara in general, there's a concept that an aseh can push off a lo taseh. Let's say that two commandments are in conflict with each other. You need to do something, but at the same time, I am not allowed to do something. I'll give you an example. I need to give a baby boy a brit milah, a circumcision, on the 8th day. What happens if that 8th day falls out on Shabbat? Now, on Shabbat, in general, you're not allowed to do a brit milah, because we're nervous that maybe you're going to carry the knife and other issues. But says the Gemara that the aseh, the positive commandment of having to do a brit milah, it is doche, it pushes off the lo taseh of we're nervous you're going to carry the knife, and therefore, if a child is born, right, 8 days, and on the 8th day it is Shabbat, the child gets a brit milah, even though in theory you might have thought that you could not do it. It is interesting, though, that the Gemara explains, not on this daf, but I'm just giving you some background. The the Gemara explains that if the Brit Milah is, let's say, not on the 8th day, for whatever reason the child is jaundiced or premature, if the child is not getting the Brit Milah on the 8th day, then let's say the next day, let's say the child is getting it on the 9th day. And if the 9th day is Shabbat, you may not do it on Shabbat. Rather, since it was already pushed off one or a couple of days, it gets pushed off another day and you do the Brit Milah on Sunday. Meaning, Aseh is only doche, the lo taseh, when it's on time. So here the Gemara says, let's say one step above that. Ein aseh doche lo taseh ve'aseh. What's the issue? We're talking about Yom Tov. We're talking about a festival. There is a lo taseh, a negative commandment, meaning we are not allowed to do work on Yom Tov, on a festival. We also have an aseh, a positive commandment of resting on Yom Tov. So Yom Tov has two, a positive and a negative commandment. Now let's take the other side, which is the aseh, the commandment to burn kachim, right? To burn something that has become ritually impure. Now, that's one against two, and therefore the Gemara says, in general, if I just have a positive commandment versus a negative commandment, it beats the negative commandment and I do the positive commandment. However, in our case here, with the shemen sreifa, I now have one aseh, positive commandment that I need to burn this oil, but it's against two commandments, one positive, one negative, and therefore the aseh is not doche. It does not cancel out the two, and therefore we may not burn the shemen sreifa on Yom Tov. Okay, I hope that wasn't too complicated. The Gemara continues and talks about what is more stringent, truma or maaser, and I'll give you two more concepts that come up. One is pigul. Pigul is if the kohen, the priest who is doing the sacrifice, has improper intent, meaning he is already planning while he's doing the sacrifice that he is going to either eat this sacrifice at the wrong time or at the wrong time, then that's called pigul. He basically invalidated that sacrifice. Notar is basically if meat is left over from a sacrifice, it needs to be burnt on the following day or 2 days later. Okay. The Gemara finishes on Kafeh. I'll just finish up. If we're allowed to burn tar on Shabbat, and basically the Gemara says we're not allowed to burn tar because, again, it smells bad and would not be proper for our Shabbat environment. Lynn is asking, Itran, yes, the Gemara says that it has a bad odor, and that's why we're not allowed to use it. But what I would like to do right now is learn a little bit about Chanukah with you. These are actually very famous sugyot, very famous parts of the Gemara. Generally, I teach this around Chanukah time, obviously, but I thought it was beautiful that it came up now in Masechet Shabbat. So I would love to look with you. This is Daf Kaf Aleph 21a, and we're going to talk about the Gemara segues from Shabbat to Chanukah. And as I mentioned before, the beginning of this Mishnah talked about what type of oil and wicks are allowed or not allowed on Shabbat. And now the Gemara asks, if something is not allowed on Shabbat, again, the reason it would not be allowed on Shabbat is because it is either basically it's improper in the sense that it is lower quality. So if it's lower quality for Shabbat, can I use that for Chanukah? So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, Ptilot v'shmanim she'amru chachamim ein madlikin behem b'Shabbat. Those wicks and the oil that we just said are not allowed to be used on Shabbat because they're inferior. So the question is, can we use them on Chanukah? So says Rav Huna, Ein madlikin behem b'Chanukah, ben b'Shabbat, ben b'Chol, right? Meaning you may not use them for Chanukah, whether it's Shabbat or Chol. So this is important to realize. Again, Chanukah is 8 days. Most of the days of Chanukah are weekdays. However, at least one, but sometimes even twice, you are lighting Chanukah candles that are going into Shabbat. So what's special about lighting before Shabbat is, A, they have to last longer, and B, we'll see in a minute. I just want to tell you, this is I don't think it's very complicated, but I actually made a chart for you. So we will look at that chart in a minute. But here you can see the beginning is here. Can you light Chanukah candles with oil and wicks that are prohibited to use on Shabbat? So Rav Huna says they are always prohibited. Let's go back to the Gemara. Amar Rava, my tama de Rav Huna. So first of all, we want to know what is the reason of Rav Huna. Kesavar, it must be that he understands kavta zakukla, meaning that if the light goes out, then you need to relight your Chanukah candles. We're going to get back to this concept in a minute. The second concept is v'mutar lishtamesh le'ora. And Rav Huna says that it must be that you can use the light of the Chanukah candles. Now, don't get nervous. We don't paskin like this. We say you are not allowed to use the light of the Chanukah candles. But here it's just interesting to realize that it was actually a machloket, right? It was actually a discussion whether or not you can use the light of the Chanukah candles. Here we have a second opinion. Rav Chisda Amar, madlikin bahen b'chol. You can use these inferior wicks and oil during the week, on the weekdays, avalo b'Shabbat, but you're not allowed to use them on Shabbat. The question is why? Kasavar, it must be that Rav Chisda holds, kavta ein zakukla, meaning that, and now we're on Kaf Aleph, Amud Bet, that if it goes out, you do not need to relight them. Again, this would be a problem on Shabbat, meaning if I'm using inferior wicks where it might go out, if it goes out and now it's Shabbat, I might be tempted to light them again, or I might say that I didn't fulfill the mitzvah because it went out and I needed to relight them. Mutar lishtamesh la'ora. Again, Rav Chisda says perhaps it is okay to use the light of the Chanukah candles. Amar Rav Zera, Amar Rav Matna. So the third opinion is going to be that of Rav Matna, quoted by Rabbi Zera. The Amrila Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav, right? Or it's Rav's opinion. Ptilot v'shmanim she'amru chachamim ein madlikin behem b'Shabbat, madlikin behem b'Chanukah, ben b'chol, ben b'Shabbat. Right? Our last opinion, either Rav Matna or Rav, is that I can use these inferior wicks and oil even on Shabbat, meaning for Chanukah again, for Chanukah during the week, or Shabbat. The question is why? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, my tama de Rav. What's the reason for Rav's opinion? Kasavar, it must be that he holds, kavta in zakukla, that if it goes out, we do not need to light it again. Ve'asur lishtamesh le'ora, right? And you are not allowed to use the light of the Chanukah candle. So I just want to show that to you here. Again, here, let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Here we go. So again, it's a three-way machloket. Rav Huna says these inferior wicks are always prohibited. Rav Chisda, and the reasons are here and here. Rav Chisda says they're permitted during the week, but prohibited on Shabbat. And Rav or Rav Matna say they're always permitted. Right? And here are the reasons. Right? What's the reason for the Chanukah candles on Shabbat? So we say, If you cannot get benefit from the Chanukah candles, then you should be able to use the inferior wicks on Shabbat because, again, if I'm not allowed to touch them, so I'm not allowed to touch it. And therefore, I could perhaps use those inferior wicks. And if you can get benefit from the Chanukah candles, then it would be prohibited to use them. Again, if I can use the Chanukah candles, I might come to what's called in the Gemara, Shema Yate et Haner. I'm nervous that I'm going to tilt the lamp. Again, just to remind ourselves, we're not talking about what we have nowadays. We're talking about, let's say, oil lamps, where they were filled with oil and there was a wick. If the light started flickering, you would be nervous that maybe the person would come to tilt the lamp so that the wick can get the oil, which of course would be prohibited on Shabbat. What are the reasons for during the week, right? If you need to relight the candles if they go out, then it's prohibited during the week. Again, we want to make sure that if you need to relight them, so I don't want to use inferior wicks because those are going to burn out much easier. If I don't need to relight the candles, then it's permitted to use those inferior wicks because it's okay that the light is going to go out. So here's just, I thought just a beautiful way to see the machloket and this idea of the types of candles and wicks you're allowed to use for Chanukah. I want to do a little bit more because I just think this is really the fundamental source for Chanukah lighting, for Chanukah candles. Tanu Rabbanan. The Gemara continues. Mitzvat Chanukah ner ish ubeito. I did skip a little portion. I'll show you here actually. The Gemara continues. We're not going to read it inside, but the Gemara continues and says, what does it mean that if it goes out, I don't need to light it? Meaning, we didn't read it here, but there's a braita in this Gemara that says the candles need to be lit from sunset till the last person leaves the shuk, the marketplace. So doesn't that imply that if the candles blow out, I would need to relight them? It seems from this source they need to be lit for that entire duration. And the Gemara basically explains that it's not actually giving us a duration that the candles must be lit. Rather, it's teaching us two other laws. One is that if you didn't light candles at sunset, you have till this time to light them. And this is very practical for those of you who work late, are not home, let's say, at sunset on an early winter day. So sunset could be quite early, and let's say you're not home to light the Chanukah candles. The Gemara explains that as long as there are people walking around on the street, you can still light your Chanukah candles. The other is that you need to fill the lamp with enough oil for it to last this entire time period. Or in our language, if you're not going to use oil, right, we need to use candles that will last, and we say for practical purposes, we say at least half an hour. So the candle needs to be at least half an hour long, if you can say that. But again, if it goes out, you do not need to relight them. So kavta v'zakukla, we say no. Kavta ein zakukla. We do not need to relight the Chanukah candles. So again, it's not Chanukah right now, but I thought it was just interesting to see this conversation here in the Gemara. And I'd like to do another very famous section of the Gemara. And here we have the source of how we light Chanukah candles. Tanu Rabbanan, mitzvat Chanukah ner ish ubeito. The basic, and here we're going to see the concept of hidur mitzvah, the concept of beautifying a mitzvah. The Gemara says that the simple, basic necessity is to light one candle per household, ner ish ubeito, meaning per household. V'hamehadrin, the people who want to beautify their mitzvah, to go, I would say, let's say, above and beyond. Ner lekol echad ve'echad. Every person in the house can have their own Chanukah, their own candle. V'hamehadrin min hamehadrin, meaning to beautify it even more. And now we have a machloket. Beit Shammai omrim, Yom Rishon madlik shmone, mikan va'elech pochet veholech. Beit Shammai says that if you want to do the best possible way to light Chanukah candles, on the first day you light 8 candles, on the second day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? From 8 to 1. Beit Hillel omrim, Yom Rishon madlik echat, mikan va'elech mosif veholech. Right? Beit Hillel, very famously, because this is what we do, he says you light a candle every day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, till 8. And now, of course, the Gemara is going to ask, why is there a machloket? Amar ula pligeba tre amorai b'marava. Right? There are 2 Amoraim, 2 Talmudic sages that in Eretz Yisrael that are going to argue why we have this contradiction between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Rav Yosef bar Avin and Rav Yosef bar Zvida. These are the 2 Amoraim, the 2 sages that are in conflict. Chad Amar, since their names are very similar, the Gemara, I think, is unsure who said which. Chad Amar Tama de Beit Shammai. The reason for Beit Shammai is Keneged Yamim Hanichnasim. Right? We're counting how many days we have left. Right? Beit Shammai says we light 8 on the first day because 8 more days of Chanukah, 7 more days of Chanukah. It's a countdown, right? 6 more days of Chanukah. Be ready because there are only 6 more days. Beit Hillel keneged yamim hayotzim, right? Beit Hillel counts the days that are past, meaning this is the first day. Tomorrow is the second day. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's why you have numbers going down and numbers going up. V'chad amar, the other sage says, the reason for the contradiction between Beit Hillel, the argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is different. V'chad amar tama de Beit Shammai keneged parei hachag, right? That the reason for Beit Shammai is likened to the sacrificial bulls that were sacrificed on the holiday of Sukkot. On Sukkot, many animals were sacrificed, and the way it went was the number diminished as the days went by, right? 14, 13, 12, 11, the numbers went down. So here they're saying that Beit Shammai says the number should go down, just like the number of sacrifices went down on Chanukah. On Sukkot. Again, Chag in the Gemara means Sukkot. V'tama de Beit Hillel, and the reason for Beit Hillel is again a very famous line: "De ma'alin bekodesh ve'ein moridin." Right? We rise, we add to sanctity, to holiness. We do not detract, meaning we don't want to take away candles, we want to add candles. And here you can see, I made this chart for you. Again, the mitzvah of Chanukah candles, the basic level is 1 candle per home per day, meaning not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Every day, 1 candle. Mehadrin, right, if you want to make it even better, even more beautiful, you can do 1 candle per person per day, right? Again, if there are 5 people in the home, then all 5 will light a Chanukah. Mahadrin mina mahadrin, the 3rd level, is what we just said is the machloket. Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, right? Beit Hillel says 1 through 8, going up in number. Beit Shammai says 8 down to 1. And here I put in the reasons. There are 2 reasons each. For the reasons for Beit Hillel is that we add holiness and we do not detract, right? So we're going to go up in number, not take down. Also, we're counting the days that passed. 1 day, right? Today's the first day, today's the second day. Beit Shammai, It is similar to the bull sacrifices on Sukkot. Again, their number went down. And also we're counting the upcoming days, right? We're going to think about the days that we have left, right? There are 8 more days, 7 more days. So I think that this is just a very interesting idea to think about. What does that mean when we count up versus count down? And in the last few minutes, I just want to show you, I would say probably the most famous section here, which is the reason for Chanukah. My Chanukah, asks the Gemara. Why do we have Chanukah? Why do we have the holiday of Chanukah? Ditanu Rabbanan, because we learned, Bekaf He Bekislev, Yomi de Chanukah, Tamanya Inun, Delo Lemisped Bahon, Videlo Lita Anot Bahon. Right? We, on the 25th day of Kislev, we have Chanukah, and there are 8 days of Chanukah where we do not eulogize a person and where we do not fast. And the question is why? Says the Gemara, when the Greeks entered the Temple Mount, they desecrated all of the oil that was on the Temple Mount. Right, and when the Chashmonaim, our heroes of the story, when they won and beat the Yevanim, the Greeks, right, they searched all over for oil to light the candelabrum, the menorah, in the temple, and they found only one jug of oil, shehaya munach bechotamo shel kohen gadol. They found it sealed, so they knew that it was not desecrated. Velo haya bo ela ladlik yom echad, right? And there was only enough oil for one day of lighting, right? For one day of oil. Na'asa bo nes, right? And a miracle occurred. V'hidlika mimenu shmona yamim, right? And therefore a miracle occurred, and for 8 days, right? The oil lasted for 8 days. L'shana acheret kav'um v'asaum yamim tovim, right? And the year after, the sages basically decreed that these days should be a festival, behalel v'hoda'ah, right? A time where we praise God and thank Him, right? And therefore, we say the prayer of Al Hanisim, right? We are thankful to God for all the miracles that occurred on Chanukah, and we say it behoda'ah, right? In Modim, in the prayer of Modim, in our Amidah. So I hope you enjoyed this year. These are, I would say, the sources for Chanukah. Again, we did when we light the candles, how we light the candles, why we light the candles. So of course, we are embarking on Pesach, but this is just making us remember Chanukah that was a few months ago. And with that, I would like to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, a good week, a Shavua Tov in health, and looking forward to seeing you next week. So thank you very much, and thank you.